I'm Anton Babkov, and this is the Climatalist Abroad. I'm taking the principles I learned in our first season from chatting to pioneers in the climate space who are proving their business can be both sustainable and profitable. And this time, I'm going global, chatting to 3 key business players from different corners of the world. In the first episode, I'm coming to you from Lake Hāwea Station, nestled in the central Otago region of New Zealand. Picture this: golden, tussock-covered hills rolling down to the deep blue waters of Lake Hāwea. Snow-capped peaks in the distance and the crisp, fresh air that reminds you just how special this part of the world is. Beyond breathtaking scenery, this place is a working farm, and one that's leading the way in the field of regenerative agriculture. Geoff Ross is the owner of Lake Hāwea Station and is my guest on today's podcast. You might recognise Geoff's name from his past as the CEO of 42 Below Vodka, one of New Zealand's premier vodka brands. These days, he's applying that same marketing, know-how and entrepreneurial spirit to farming. His mission is to prove that farming can actually be part of the climate solution. Regenerative agriculture is about working with nature rather than against it, building soil health, improving biodiversity, and ultimately drawing down more carbon than is emitted. And here at Lake Hāwea, Geoff and his team are proving that good regenerative practices can lead to major green premium benefits. Their merino wool, for example, is actually sourced in a carbon positive way, which means they draw down more CO2 than they emit in the production of their wool. That wool is then being sold at a premium to global brands like Allbirds, who are using it to create the world's first carbon zero shoe. It's a clear signal that consumers are willing to pay more for products that are truly sustainable, and that regenerative farming isn't just about ethics, it's about economics. So what does regenerative farming actually look like in practice? How do you turn a conventional farm into a carbon negative operation? And what can the rest of the world learn from Lake Hāwea Station? Let's find out. Geoff, welcome to Climatalist.
Yeah, great to be here. Kia ora.
So we'll jump straight in. After a career as a marketing exec, including creating 42 Below, a globally recognized alcohol brand, why farming?
Probably 3 reasons. One, I grew up on a farm. I actually went to university to become a farmer, but got diverted into advertising and then consumer brands and then our own consumer brand. So the intent was always to come back here at some stage into farming. Secondly there's a growing debate really, or kind of, I wouldn't even say it's a debate, it was kind of a big view, particularly in this country, toward farming being a contributor to climate change. So the kind of the curiosity in us was wanting to ask the question: is there a way to actually, for farming to actually be a solution in climate change? So that question was starting to grow inside us. And thirdly, I guess because, more of an emotive reason really, growing up on a farm, I think my dad kind of unknowingly was one of the first farmer conservationists. He was quite protective of key areas of bush and waterways. And, I wanted to kind of, and it was a really rewarding part of growing up, particularly in my teenage years, going through, working next to Dad, developing a farm with that type of mentality. And I wanted to kind of see if we could put it into action ourselves. So those are the key reasons, really.
It's amazing. It's interesting you mentioned your father. My dad was a fisherman, and sustainability was really critical in the way that he thought about things. And it's funny how things repeat back on you when you're like,
yeah.
One of the team that we've had here at the offsite in Wanaka has talks a lot about circularity.
Right.
There's a lot of circularity in the story, it sounds like. So, it's incredible to be here at Lake Hāwea Station. It's a beautiful property, deeply manicured. So compared to some of the farms that we've seen, it's stunning. What does this place mean to you?
Well, I guess now it's our home, but that, you don't just create a home in weeks. We've been here around 6 years, and the whole project grew on us really. So we came here because we wanted to farm, and because we did want to do so in a very environmentally strong way, and we wanted to see if farming could actually be part of the climate change solution. But what it means 6 years in is, I think the first 4, possibly even 5 years were really, really hard. But it feels like we're just getting to a point now where we kind of know the farm. Like when I first got here, an older farmer said to me, the first 5 years the farm will farm you, and then there'll come a point where you'll feel like you're actually farming the farm. And I think, touch wood, we're getting to that point. But also, so we kind of got the hang of it, again, touch wood. Seasons always test you. But I think it's starting to be a place of rewards. When you look around, you can see some of the work we've done. It was a big canvas. First couple of years, you wondered if you're making any headway, but now there's starting to be signs of the work we've done here, and that's quite rewarding.
It's funny, my brother Alex has recently bought a 2-hectare property in Brisbane. When he bought it, I remember he had this look on his face, slightly shaken as he was approaching the purchase of it. And he said, I don't know if I'm man enough for it. It sounds like, 2 hectares. How big is the farm?
6,500 hectares. So in acre terms, that's around 16,500 acres, yeah.
And what's on the farm? So for those that don't know the context, what are the assets?
Well, it's called Lake Hāwea Station because we're on the shores of Lake Hāwea, which is one of the southern lakes, the key kind of 3 southern lakes. We're on the northeastern end of Lake Hāwea. So we've got around 7 kilometres of lakefront, then some terraces, where probably the more fertile ground is, then some steep hill country, which the merino sheep love, and then it rises right up into Otago tussock country, and that country is only really utilised in the summer. That we call that summer camp for the ewes, the mums. That's when the teenage children get too much for them. That's when we give them a break and send them into summer camp for a few months. So yeah, it's mixed really. Lakefront terraces, some steep green hills, and then the big tussock country.
So sounds beautiful. So you mentioned sheep. You've also got cattle. You've got a tourism element to the business. So what did the business look like originally, and what does it look like today in terms of the assets?
Well, when we took over the farm, it was merino, and we made a change in our cattle strategy. We moved to pure Angus cattle because we believe there's more of an opportunity to get a premium and with using the Angus genes. But we have added tourism. We've got 3 cottages and a wee tiny home here now, and then also some kind of branded goods as well. Usually goods that we quite like using ourselves. Some of the sweaters we sell our wool to. Some of the items that we use ourselves in the cottages that we think have the right message or the right kind of environmental usage.
Brilliant. And is this a family business? Are they involved in the farm?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, again, that kind of grew on us as well, So I guess I'm more involved in the farming side. My wife has started the tourism side. She runs that. Finn, my son, he's just finished his PhD in climate science-related subject in kelp, and his speciality is more in blue carbon, and the ocean is a solution. But he's been very involved here. And then my youngest son, Gabe, just finished university, and he's outdoors and content. So he's got a property called the Weekend Mish, and so they film their hunting, fishing, diving, and their antics out in the wild. And he's also creating a hunting tourism business here. So whilst it can be a contentious subject in this country, at least, red deer, tahr, chamois, pigs, they're all invasive species, and one of our biggest threats to our native flora and fauna. So monetizing a hunting business is actually a good way of balancing that, those herds, and in a way that it supports the local, the native flora and fauna.
It's an amazing balance, isn't it? Like all the things that you can integrate and still hit the environmental benefit.
Yeah.
So I remember you from 42 Below. I've had some very interesting experiences with 42 Below Peugeot flavour, which put me off eating or drinking anything Peugeot related for about a decade. But tell us about that. What was the genesis of it? How what was the outcome that you got to?
The genesis was I was actually in the US working on New Zealand tourism. I'd been in a research group where someone had described New Zealand as the Sweden of the South Pacific. And I was a big follower and lover of the Absolute advertising campaign. It was one of the iconic campaigns. And so I was clearly aware that Absolute was from Sweden. And so then, you started to think, well, hang on, if the world perceives us as a Sweden-like environment, could we therefore create our own vodka? And then I looked around and thought, well, actually, a lot of my friends are drinking vodka. We were drinking vodka. The cocktail renaissance, one of the many cocktail renaissances we've had, was building. Vodka at that time, anyway, was a key ingredient in most cocktails, so that's kind of where it came from. And look, we distilled ourselves. I was distilling in the garage really poorly for the first few years, got someone else involved in the distillation process who was much better than I, and got some capital, which was critical, and ended up getting not only capital, but a lot of skill and support from that investor, and in fact, two key investors. So even though I was the CEO of 42 Below, it was kind of like three CEOs, myself, Grant and Steve. And then at that point, we listed in New Zealand and grew pretty quickly, and we sold to Bacardi in late 06 for 138 million. So from garage to 138 million in about, it was probably about 7 years, I think. Yeah, so look, we're really fortunate with time as well, and fortunate with the people that got involved with that business.
So let's bring it back to the farming. So take us back to when you acquired the farm. What were the opportunities that you saw in this place?
Well, we, like a lot of Auckland families, had holidayed in Central Lakes, Queenstown, came here for skiing, loved the area, thought, let's buy a small farm here. So we put an offer in on a 40-acre block, and we walked the boundary rather quickly with the boys. And at the end of that walk, the boys said to me, Dad, it's too small. They were both keen on their hunting. And so we said, okay, maybe it is too small. We'll look further from Queenstown and look for something larger. And then the farming bug kind of was reignited, and we looked at about 7 or 8 properties within 2 hours drive of Queenstown, and finally settled here.
Amazing. And what did you see? What was the potential that you saw here?
Look, a lot of potential, actually. I'd been through that process I mentioned with my dad, where we were off a dairy farm, but he bought a very rough, undeveloped hill country block covered in gorse, and we worked our ass off for about 5 years, with particularly my dad. And in that time, I saw it turn into a beautiful, park-like deer farm, very productive deer farm. And I saw a lot of opportunity here, but we bought it naively and through rose-tinted glasses. We thought, hey, that'll take a couple of months and this much money. And of course, like all new businesses, 2 years later and
twice as long and half as good.
Yeah, many dollars later, you're making a small impact. So yeah, it was a beautiful location, but it needed, in our view at least, it could do with a bit of love and a bit of development.
So what changes? Walk us through the changes that you made. So operationally, strategically.
Operations. The first thing that we did, we fenced up the lake. And because and a lot of the key waterways, because the stock were in the lake, and the reason they're in the lake is they needed a drink, so, and cattle just love standing in water for some reason. So we that's not great for water quality, albeit, to be fair, in pretty low numbers for the amount of water that's there, but nonetheless it's still a contributor to poor water quality. So we fenced off the lake. We put in a stock water system, so the stock didn't need to go into the lake or the creeks. We then we're now up to 25,000 native trees. So we've not only fenced off the lake, we've created a 35-metre buffer between pasture and lake, and that's where all the native trees have gone into. Miles and miles and miles of fencing, so we can keep stock out of key places. We have identified all the endangered species, critically endangered. There's 5 critically endangered species here, so we've got a protection and development plan for each of those. We've quantified our carbon footprint. We've done all our accounting. We've just updated it. So we sequester or remove almost twice as much carbon as we emit. So obviously there's emissions. We will talk about this soon. Maybe from the stock is a large one, methane, biometric methane. But we sequester through the growing of trees more carbon than we emit. We've become B Corp, the first B Corp certified sheep farm in the world, and we were the first carbon certified farm in Australasia.
Yeah, look, I think let's break that. Let's double click on the carbon point, the emissions point. So, walk us through what are the emissions in a typical farm of this type? Sheep, cattle, the whole mix, and what's the value in mitigating the emissions?
Great. Okay. Look, this is, as we talked about, this is an extensive farm. So it's a large land mass with relatively low animal numbers on a per hectare basis. We've got 10,000 sheep and 200, almost 300 Angus cows. So that over 6,500 hectares is relatively low stocking rate. We're also fortunate, one of the great things about coming to a property that perhaps wasn't intensively grazed was that there's a lot of regenerating bush and scrub going on naturally. Yeah. So the profile on the emissions side of things, we're around 73% comes from biometric methane. So our biggest number is stock. I would have thought, we have to create some baleage and silage for winter feed, and there's some weeks here where we've got tractors going, feels like 24/7 for a couple of weeks. The fossil fuel number is relatively low, and then those are the key ones really. We don't use any synthetic nitrogen as a fertilizer. Nitrous oxide can be a greenhouse gas and can be a contributor on a lot of farms. We don't use nitrogen. Through regenerative farming, we believe we can fix nitrogen naturally through the plant selection we use. So that's our biggie. Ideally, we want to remove fossil fuels altogether. There's electric tractors coming. We've got energy here, but we buy from renewables. But we're going to go, one of our houses is completely solar and hydro, and we're going to take the whole farm solar and hydro as well.
So what are you going to do with the hydro? Sounds interesting.
We've got, the great thing about hills and creeks is you've got water and gravity, and it's a great little hydro system. So we've done one already. It's a little wheel about this big. It's not that fast, but when you've got, they call it head, water pressure coming even through a pipe this big, that thing is just motoring 24/7. So that's generating a lot of electricity. So
amazing.
We'll do the same.
So Kim Landreth, who we saw, showed us a creek that's sort of going down his property, and he's put a washing machine engine in there and is generating electricity that way.
Well, people were doing it long before we have. The first farmers were. Yeah.
And the value, so carbon negative, so you sequester based on the methods that you have in your regenerative farming practice, which involves trees.
Yeah, the sequestering in New Zealand, at least, we can only count trees. So as yet, we can't count soil or any of the grass types. So we believe, and we've started measuring soil carbon, and soil is on the hierarchy of the planet's sequesterers. Ocean is number one by a long way, soil's number two, and then forest trees are number three.
Wow.
Yeah. So the United Nations came out with a fact around 4 years ago that if the world's built soil carbon in 0.04% globally, that would reduce atmospheric carbon to what it was before the industrial age. Wow. So soil and the ocean have huge opportunities. But soil hasn't really been looked at yet because it's harder to count, and it can go up like that. It can go like this, whereas trees typically grow like this into it.
So you need to get a long-term view, and you need something strong verification capability.
100%, yeah.
And are you folks working on that problem?
Yeah. We've started. So a lot of farmers will have soil tests which will test for soil carbon, but it's only in 30 centimetres, and that's not enough. So we're now testing to a metre, and because that's kind of the international standard for really understanding if you are building soil carbon.
And what sort of timescale do you need to get the sample?
3 years. Yeah, so you can't count it until you've done tests for 3 years because you get that seasonal and yearly variation.
So is it annual variation? Is it climate responsive, or is it just seasonal?
Both. In a dry year, you can lose it. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. Yeah, and we can talk more about the other ways you lose it are through tillage, which we typically don't do through regeneration. Through regenerative.
So tillage, that is disturbing the soil.
Yeah, ploughing, disking. Yeah. So that's kind of the simplistic. So yeah, we're 2,700 tons of greenhouse gas equivalents is what we emit, and we're sequestering for I think 4,300 tonnes, through trees, really. Ones were planted, but actually more than that, ones that are just naturally regenerating in some of those steeper marginal areas of the farm.
Yeah, interesting. And so the trees, does the CO2 capture tail off as the trees mature?
Yeah, but in native forests, much later. It's about at 80 years.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, whereas exotics will tail off at about 30, and then they actually start. They can actually they come back a bit and then flatten out.
So there's some interesting regulatory changes happened quite recently in New Zealand around this topic. Can you give us a little bit on that?
So, and look, I'll try and keep this short. So 7 years ago, we had a change of government, and one of the moves was we want to ban foreign ownership of New Zealand farms. There's too many kind of farms being sold to foreign entities. One of the coalition government partners said, okay, we accept that with the exception of those people who are buying forests for trees, for exotic trees.
Pine trees.
Pine trees, yeah. And because they had a real forestry interest, they were part of the forestry kind of group, really. So what you've seen then is over the last 7 years, a lot of farms being sold in New Zealand to companies like IKEA, who will come onto a perfectly good pastoral farm. I don't want to single out one company because it's just happened to a lot, but then they will plant monoculture pines, and then that land, the bugger with monoculture pines is the soil then becomes pretty much stuffed, it becomes acidic. Monocultures typically don't exist in nature anywhere, not that I've ever actually encountered or thought of. So because of that, you don't have diversity, and as soon as you don't have diversity in nature, you have risk. You have risk of fire, risk of pests, risk of wind blow, all sorts of other things, risk of water quality issues. So yeah, the government has finally said, okay, we're going to stop that. We want more forest, but it should be diverse forests.
Good native forest. Yeah. Brilliant.
Yeah.
All right, so let's turn to the business a little bit more.
Yeah.
So before we jump into the point around green premium and the value of the regenerative practice, if you're willing to share, how does revenue break down between wool, beef, tourism in the farm? Yeah,
sure. Wool is the biggest. Fine wool, merino wool, which Australia will be very familiar with, is the biggest. That's around 45%. Lamb is around 30%. Beef is around 10. I'm going to have to get my math right here. And then tourism is smaller, but it's growing.
Growing.
Yeah. And then the other revenue is we are looking, and we have done some small amounts of this, of monetizing the excess carbon sequestration, or quantifying that and using that as an offset that we can sell to companies, or we can inset to companies that we're selling our wool to, so they can use the positive balance in their supply chain, which is what we've done with Allbirds, which are about to launch the world's first carbon zero shoe. So they got their emissions in the production of that shoe, really close to zero. They cut as much as they possibly could, but they couldn't quite get to zero. But by buying our wool, which has a positive balance, they could then inset that to get that shoe to zero.
To zero or negative, is it?
I think it is negative, because they had to build a buffer in there for, because carbon accounting is pretty precise, but not, like any new science, not super precise yet. So they put a buffer in there. Yeah.
So Allbirds, Sheep Inc., Another Tomorrow. These are some really interesting brands. So let's now get into the premium piece. So
okay.
Tell us about that. Tell us about the partners that you work with and how you're positioning the product that's coming from this beautiful property.
Yeah. Well, before let's just imagine we had not even spoke on this discussion about the environment, about carbon, about biodiversity, about any of those things. Let's imagine we'd only spoke about building a premium for what we sell. So the way you do that, at least the way I was taught in marketing, is you go and speak to your customer.
Only from the best marketers in Australia and New Zealand.
I was very
let's try that.
Yeah. So you go and speak to your customer, and you listen, and you hear what they're telling you and what they need and what their customers need. And look, when we went and spoke to those people buying wool, fine wool is largely for clothing, and a lot of it's luxury fashion. What they were telling us is their consumers are becoming increasingly climate aware. They're really conscious about animal welfare. That's a big one. How are those sheep being handled? a lot of their customers think that for a sheep to be shorn, it's brutally handled, or in some case, it's actually killed, which is not the case. So, but as a marketer, you don't just say, that's a lot of bullshit, mate. You know, you have to take that on board and you have to disprove that. So climate, animal welfare, and then the big one that was starting to emerge more and more in a lot of conversation was regenerative farming. To be fair, not many people kind of understood it, but they kept on coming up with this word regenerative. When Vogue magazine comes out with an article that says regenerative farming can save the world, and they've got a specific editor that knows a lot about that subject, that's probably something, if you're producing something for the fashion world, you need to listen to.
Your ears are pricking.
Yeah.
Point. Yeah.
So then the next question is, okay, if that's what they want, you know, and what is the market currently delivering? Where's your unique selling point? How do you get a competitive advantage? And then once you get a competitive advantage, that's your ability then to create a premium, which, by the way, we do gain.
So what does that premium look like? So across this, if you're willing to share.
Look, it's anywhere from, and I won't go into kind of detail, it's anywhere from 20% to double.
Wow.
Yeah.
God, that's extraordinary.
Yeah. In wool, I'd say we've kind of got a developing model. I wouldn't say we've cracked meat yet. Yeah, that's the next challenge.
So one of the things we've been talking about, you know, since Dad and I always spoke about New Zealand having this beautiful, clean, green image, and the country has come from being an incredibly wealthy country in the 60s and 70s off the back of farming products.
Yeah.
Farming and food being commoditized through the 90s and the noughties. And New Zealand has kind of fought back, but not really won the premium war. Is this that moment where New Zealand can actually position itself in that way?
It could be if we act, you know. Yeah, absolutely could be. If you look, you know, the EU is developing, you know, food and fibre labelling with by 26, I think. If you look at our key markets, you know, particularly Europe, particularly east and west coast of the US, Southeast Asia, Japan, there's a really strong customer base moving towards, ideally, you know, carbon zero, regeneratively grown food and fibre. Yeah, but we're not the only ones in the world, you know, with this opportunity. If you look at other agricultural nations, Australia's, I think, doing really well in this space. So too are countries like Ireland, Denmark, surprisingly, growing a lot of indoor hydroponic. Fiji, you know, they're one of the smallest countries in the world, and I think I'll probably have the stat wrong. I think they're the bigger fresh produce is now like number 2 as an earner for Denmark or something. You know,
wow.
Yeah, it's crazy. So there are opportunities there.
You know, the obstacle is the way, right? It's but I still, you know, my marketing hat goes on, and I think, okay, greenhouse is great. Look at the beauty that we're surrounded by. You know, why are we not capitalizing this in New Zealand?
Yeah.
New Zealand?
Well, look, there's a lot of steps between the farm and the consumer. The global macro trend, in my view, is that consumers want to connect with the farm. So that's the first tailwind that I think we have going our way. You know, if you speak to customers worldwide, they want to know, they don't want to know kind of the factory that food or fibre came from. They want to know the farm that it came from. They want to know the farmer. They want to know their values, their personality, what they stand for, how it's grown. One of the few benefits, well, there are many benefits obviously with, you know, social media, but one of the few is that you can see into the backyard of that farm, you know, daily, and it gives a consumer an opportunity to make a connection and a relationship. And if that relationship is built, then that's a way of, you know, monetizing what you produce. The challenges are all the parts in the middle. You know, the big producers, they're set up for scale. Like if you look at a meat plant, right, it's set up for huge volumes per day. And starting a new business, you can't, you know, produce, you know, 3,000 cuts of lamb, you know, in one day for one customer. It's going to be difficult to start a business that way. So you've somehow got to get the capital to be able to start small. We talked about entrepreneurship, you know about it. you've got to endure those early years of chewing cash, building plant, connecting with customers, building your own distribution, and that's high risk, and it takes time. And you're competing with those who are kind of still pretty wed to a price and commodity type approach. So you've got to do a hell of a lot of marketing to really connect with the right customers. Because we've connected directly with fashion brands as our customer, I guess, as in a B2B sense, even though we don't have the processing, facility, we can't spin our own wool. They then come back down the chain, putting pressure on the spinner, the top maker, and all the steps in the chain to say, hey, we want Lake Hāwea Station wool. We don't want to buy it on the auction. We want this wool because it's, carbon zero, or we want this wool because it's B Corp certified. And they'll put pressure, and then those kind of doors open, and the wool is processed in a single source batch, and is spun in a single source batch, and it does get to the consumer as a single source wool.
So you're using the customer to drive the value chain in your direction.
Yeah, because as always, one of the things I learned in marketing, demand will mean people find a way.
Yeah. And on that demand point, so, you folks are innovating in the space, you're securing these premiums. At the same time, you mentioned there are other folks globally that are innovating in the space.
Yeah.
Do we run out of premium?
Look, that's a really good question. Potentially, but not for a long, long time.
It's a good problem to have.
Yeah, it'll be a good problem to have. And by then, like in all sectors, there'll be another premium.
The next wave.
And I think one of the waves that's coming, we haven't talked much about it, will be biodiversity. So, I think the discussion 15 years ago in New Zealand was the environmental discussions were around water. Now it's moved to carbon. I reckon the big one coming in time is biodiversity.
The aggregate view of the environment.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely there's a lot of stuff happening. I view it from I put my capitalist hat on, a lot of stuff around the natural capital space, and biodiversity monitoring, verification, the whole piece is really important.
Much more difficult to measure than carbon, but it's coming at some stage.
Amazing. So let's switch to some reflections. Obstacles, so you mentioned some early things that have popped up along the way. What's gone wrong? What are some highlights of lessons learned along the way?
Obstacles were like when we did our first multi-species pasture. We couldn't buy a multi-species seed mix, so you couldn't find anyone to mix it. So we had to mix it ourselves. You buy, X kind of kilograms of this species, X kilograms of this species, mix it all up in a concrete mix and put it back into the drill. And then I was really impatient. Said, it's warm, it's just rained, let's get the seed in the ground. But then it kind of peaks in kind of late summer when it really should be peaking in May, June, going into winter. So you learn a lot about mix, you learn a lot about timing in a physical sense. On the market-facing side of things, I think one of the things we learned was, how do you value climate-positive wool, or how do you value climate-positive meat? And we really struggled with that for a while. How do you get the premium? And then we realized there is a carbon market. Today carbon in New Zealand is being sold for $64 a tonne. So we know the emissions profile per kg of wool. The LCA on a kg of wool is 34 kilograms of greenhouse gas.
LCA?
Yeah, life cycle assessment. So over the life of that sheep during that year, if you harvest 1 kg of wool, to produce that 1 kg of wool, it has emitted 34 kgs of greenhouse gas. So that if you want to get that to zero, how much you've got to inset. And so we were able to use the carbon markets to put a value on it, which is a great way of ascribing a premium to your wool if you want climate positive wool. So we've learned some of those, marketing techniques to kind of give a black and white way of ascribing value.
Got it. And the role of this place in the community, how's that sort of played out?
Well, I guess we didn't come here trying to demonstrate that there is a better way, because that would be incredibly arrogant, and we were never going to get it right in kind of day one. But what we tried to demonstrate, and this has probably been the frustrating point, is what we tried to demonstrate is that there are always different ways of doing things. If farmers, when we first came here, there's a lot of perceived change going on in farming, and there's a lot of people going, I don't want this change. Now, if I look at other sectors, if you look at tech, right, there is just constant change on a daily basis. Pretty much every sector in the world is going through change. If you look at aviation, massive change at the moment. Tourism, massive change at the moment. So farming is never going to be immune from change, and it shouldn't be. And in fact, if looking at it differently, if you are kind of the instigator of change, that's where you're more likely to get a premium from.
You win.
Yeah, rather than just being a follower. And I do think New Zealand potentially has slipped behind over the last 20, 30 years in farming. So the frustration has been not from people saying, I'm not sure if that regen stuff is the right way of going. The frustration has been from, we don't need to look at that, and that's the dangerous point. I think I need to always be looking at what other farmers are doing, and I think vice versa.
Yeah. It makes a lot of sense. I think, the change point is interesting, right? Where humans are afraid of change, but we also crave novelty. So how do we, there's some really interesting stuff happening here. And I think like looking at that novel picture, there's a real show. There's a performance happening in this on this property, and I think more people should be tuning in.
Well, people love stories. People love, rightly or wrongly, people love connecting with other people. So they need to know values. They need to know personality. That's the part of the definition of brand. And if you're going to, the reason why a Mercedes is worth double what a Toyota is yes, it is probably a better car, but there's a hell of a lot of brand in it. It's like the same with Chanel, or I don't know many trends. Like I don't know, Marks and Spencer or something like that. A lot of it is brand, and brand comes from telling your stories.
You got to tell a good story. One of the areas that I'm really passionate about is the role of First Nations people as custodians of the land. And I grew up in the New Zealand tradition. The Māori people are very powerful, and they've done a tremendous job of shifting the conversation. I went to law school here in New Zealand in the early 2000s, and the shift even since then in terms of the regulatory power and the influence that Māori people rightfully have on the political landscape and on the way that we manage our environment is really powerful. What relationship have you had with the Maori people or the Māori people, and in particular Ngāi Tahu? Yeah,
so Ngāi Tahu is our iwi, and the particular hapu that we would connect with is from Moraki on the coast. And look, via kamatua called Darren Wiwi, based in Queenstown, who's been here a lot. We've learned a lot about the role Māori played here at Lake Hāwea and on Lake Hāwea Station. So a really cool story is Māori would come here in the summer to harvest freshwater mussels, eels, and also the new bracken growth. And they would do a 6-day hike from Moraki up the Waitiki Valley, over Linda's Pass, and then right over the saddle, up behind our house and down through this valley. Wow. So this valley was a key trail for the Moraki hapu. And so, look, what we all love is authentic stories and connections to where our food and fibre comes from. So having that authenticity, not from just kind of this year, not from 50 years ago, but from hundreds of years ago, I think adds value to the property. It adds value to our story and what we're growing here. And I think in some cases it helps us understand the biodiversity that we should be trying to bring back here. Like Darren talks about, all of these creeks around the lake, what I mentioned before, would have had blue duck in them. There's no blue duck or whio in those creeks at the moment. Can we bring those back? To do that, obviously, you've got to have pristine creek environments surrounded by bush. We've got to have those buffer that we talked about before. So added a lot to the tourism. Matariki is a key event in the Māori calendar every June. So we have a Māori New Year where we do stargazing. Darren, Kamatua Darren, gives the Māori view on the galaxies. We look at the Matariki constellation, which appears at that time. So that it's adding a huge amount of value.
So for our Aussie listeners or other listeners, Kamatua?
Kamatua is a senior or an elder in Māoridom. Yeah.
Got it. Sounds like an amazing relationship.
Yeah.
So let's drill into one more point around the business. So you mentioned tourism is small but growing. What's driving that growth?
Look, to our surprise, people want to understand what regenerative farming is. And look, I was interested in agriculture, but I thought pretty much not many other folks from the city would be. But whether it's Clarkson's Farm or whether it's Yellowstone or whether it's, I think, something much bigger than that, which is people are genuinely becoming interested in where their food and fibre comes from and how it's growing. I think there's that interest, that, that global trend, that macro trend where people want to connect and understand, where their food and fibre comes from. So people are coming here and wanting to stay here because they want to get out in the pasture. They want to see the multi-species pasture. They want to see, and touch the merino wool. They want to understand how you become climate positive, So that has really surprised us, that people are really curious about that stuff. So this is the interesting question, right? If people are really keen on regenerative farming and want to learn about it and it's helping grow our tourism, could tourism therefore help grow our agriculture? And are the two linked far more than we have originally thought? And I would think yes, and particularly so for New Zealand. What are our two biggest earners? Agriculture and tourism, by far. So why aren't we putting them together? Because if tourists have a fantastic impression of our farming, it's going to support more farmers. If those buying our produce think to your initial point, Anton, this is a green, beautiful, pristine nation. It's going to actually, and we use that in our agriculture. It's actually going to drive tourism, and the two can potentially build each other.
It does sort of shift the tourism conversation away from being extractive to being reciprocal, learning, sharing, understanding, going away, buying more, all of those things.
It does. I don't know about you, but when I visit a winery and I hear from one of the winemakers or do a tasting in the cellar door, that typically becomes one of my favorite wines, and I might subscribe to that wine, and I know how to tell the story about that wine. And I think the potential is true for those that may visit our farms.
Fascinating. So looking forward, we touched on a few of these things. What future do you see for farming? So 10 years, cast your mind 10 years.
Look, a huge part of me is optimistic. If I listen to consumers, I have a real kind of dose of optimism, because I think they are showing us some clear signals of where farming needs to go. And I think, I like personally, some of the values that they want in their food and fibre, and I think we can get there. But then I have moments of realism, and when I hear people kind of not wanting to listen to views on the other side of the world, or customers in market, or when I see kind of some of the inability to change of potentially some large organizations who are just set up for scale, I realize there's quite a few challenges to actually, meeting that growing consumer need.
I'm an M&A lawyer by training, and one of the things that a small guy can do to attract the attention of a bigger player is to hurt them.
Yeah.
I think coming at it from a competitive standpoint and commanding this premium. Yeah. Maybe not a green premium, but a premium for regenerative farming products.
Yeah. Look, we're now getting a lot of inbound inquiry to a point where there's getting some sizable demand there, far more than we can service, and therefore, that's becoming a material amount of demand that even a big business, I would think, will be interested in.
Or maybe a collection of farmers that have got an interesting similarity in terms of the product they produce.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Brilliant. Who are you inspired by?
Many people actually. Probably those closest to me, like my father I mentioned, my wife, who's a real great kind of has a good nose for global consumer behaviour. I think both my sons, it was to be fair, it was our eldest son who pushed us into getting our carbon accounting initiated. I boldly kind of was able to say, yeah, we're the first certified, carbon zero farm in Australasia. But the truth is, if it wasn't for Finn, we wouldn't have got there. And so them and their work ethic of the boys. I think Charlie Arnott has been a great influence on us. What it pastures a lot of the other farms that we talked about globally.
Brilliant. And final question, what does your future look like? What does Lake Hāwea Station, what does its future look like? So you've kind of you've survived the first 5 years, so you're now farming instead of it farming you. What does it look like for you in the future?
I think, maybe this is for vanity or for some other weird reason, but I think having the farm look like that park, that park-like vision is important to me, whether that came from Dad or whether that came from sitting in a tower block in a city for decades late at night working, and dreaming of a farm. When we get there, you kind of want that farm to look as beautiful as your dream was. So, I think we'll continue with the development and the beautification of the farm. I think we can do a lot more in the wool space with climate positive wool. We've got some interesting initiatives going on with some new brands in that space. And then I'd love to crack regenerative climate positive meat. There's a few interesting models in the UK we're starting to look at, kind of a direct-to-consumer model.
So you see this isn't your retirement, you're ready to go.
Yeah. More trees. We're at 25,000. Our goal is 100,000. Yeah. We've got critically endangered. The last population in the world of the western grand skink, a big 30 centimetre lizard, is on our place. There is, we think, about 40 individuals. That's viable but we need to get that to 400 individuals really. So there's a lot of goals yet to tick off.
Lots to do.
Yeah.
Like a good farmer, lots to do.
There's always lots to do on a farm. Yeah.
Geoff, thank you very much.
Pleasure, Anton.